Good evening. I'm Joe Nye, the Dean at the Kennedy School, and it's my great pleasure to introduce to you tonight His Excellency Pascal Lamy, who is the European Union's Trade Commissioner. One of the great interesting things that has happened in the world is, though many ways people talk about a world of unipolarity or hyperpower, when it comes to the area of trade, the United States is not a hyperpower. When one looks at trade, one sees a considerable balance between Europe and the US and Japan. So the role that Europe has played in trade has been a remarkable accomplishment of the European Union, and the European Trade Commissioner is probably one of the more important people in Europe. It's not surprising that Pascal Lamy occupies this position. If one looks at his educational background, it is an example of the best in the French educational system. He has a degree from Haute Études Commerciales, which is the HEC Business School, a Diplôme d'études supérieures de droit, which is a law diploma. He's also graduated from the Institut d'études politiques, which is political science studies, and he has been a student at the École nationale d'administration, which is the pinnacle of the French educational system for public service. Indeed, anyone who has graduated from ENA is known as an énarque. They are thereafter always going to be important in French life. He joined the Treasury Department after a period as Inspecteur Général des Finances, and he then became an advisor to Jacques Delors, the French finance minister, who later went on to be president of the European Union Commission. In between, he was deputy chief of staff for Prime Minister Pierre Mauroy, and when Delors went to become president of the Commission, Pascal Lamy became the chief of staff for Jacques Delors. In 1994, he left government to serve as a member of the team responsible for restructuring the then financially troubled Crédit Lyonnais, and was ultimately named Director General of the bank. So he had an interesting private sector experience as well as a distinguished government career. Returned, though, in 1999 to become the European Commissioner from Trade. So Pascal Lamy has a distinguished record. I should also add that he is a marathon runner. And those who know him say that that combination of a keen intellect and boundless energy is why he has been so successful as the EU's Trade Commissioner. So please join me in welcoming to the Kennedy School, Pascal Lamy.
Well, thank you for this introduction. It's a pleasure to be here this evening at the Kennedy School Forum. Everyone has told me that it's a tough place to speak. I'm told I need to address both the pointy-headed intellectual types from the Harvard government department, who are only interested in analysis, and the ferocious policy wonks from Kennedy School, who are only interested in solutions. Well, let me confront reality straight away. I don't have solutions, or even a definitive response to the maelstrom of questions which swells around globalization. But I do have an approach, and that is why I would like to sketch it this evening. First question, an unescapable question, however, to what precisely are we responding? As Anthony Giddens puts it, most people agree that globalization has something to do with the thesis that we are now all live in one world. But thereafter, of course, opinions differ sharply. In my view, globalization is primarily if not exclusively, the latest transformation of market capitalism. It is based on comparative advantage, economies of scale, and innovation, which I mean man's innate desire to go in new directions. That is what lies behind the wave of technological innovation in information, in biotechnology, in transport, behind the increasing openness of world markets for goods and services, and behind 24-hour world financial markets. Of course, we can speculate as to whether we are simply surfing the wave of autonomous decisions in the United States and Europe to grant market access, or in Asia to grant liberalized direct investment. But if so, one big wave with a huge increase in trade since 1950s and an even huger increase in foreign direct investment. As to whether globalization is just another twist in the capitalist road, or more than that, I don't know. But it is a genuinely radical force in the true sense of the word. And it has had dramatic effects on sovereignty. It has had dramatic effects on democratic accountability and legitimacy. And most importantly, it has had dramatic effects on the real economy and on real people. So globalization has another key and dynamic aspect, which is the role of civil society, the NGO, the children of globalization. They have ensured that globalization is about much more than dry economics waged on a multinational scale. It is about a process, about perceptions, about the unsociable, unstoppable internet. It's about new cross-cultural, multicultural way of living. Globalization may, of course, confront us with new fears, but it also offers new ways of addressing those fears. In other words, globalization may also challenge our very sense of identity in the positive as well as in the negative sense. So is globalization a good thing? My own answer to this is yes, yes, but. The but is becoming clearer. Unfettered, unharnessed, unsteered globalization could become a high-speed, heavily loaded truck carrying down a slippery mountain road. In the first place, it risks bringing growing inequality between and within countries. Poverty levels were actually reduced from 1950 to 1990 in developing countries. But this trend has now, sadly, been reversed. But also between developed countries, the ferocious US economy now produces 30% more GNP per head than in Europe. Fine, some Europeans would say. We have holidays. We have universal health care. But the EU is still not yet an egalitarian utopia with 60 million living in poverty. Even with comfortable Western society, globalization risks fueling the sense of powerlessness, the disenchantment with the world that is becoming so evident. Amid unparalleled prosperity, people believe that their world is an unprecedentedly fragile one. I am struck by the fact that the pollsters looking at the US presidential race in June said that Gore ought to win by about 10 points simply because of economy. Who knows what will happen next Tuesday, but that sort of big win now seems unlikely. Of course, this election is about many things, but this time around, voters don't seem to be rewarding the incumbent from the strength of the economy as much as one could have thought. So why are we in this situation? First, This is relative expectations coming home to roost. The developed world, but particularly the US, has hardwired into its mythology the notion that each successive generation will do better than its predecessor, and, of course, better than the generations next door. At some point, of course, both those notions become environmentally, politically, and perhaps emotionally undeliverable. But also, secondly, people simply feel less in control of their destiny. I am, for instance, deeply worried at the declining participation rates in elections. To quote from a US bumper sticker, "Don't vote, it only encourages politicians." We in Europe used to smirk about participation rates in US elections, but our own levels of turnout are starting to descend to US levels of apathy. Still worse, and there's the identity point again, we may see a rise of the extreme right, and this on both sides of the Atlantic. Underlying this is a fundamental dilemma. Globalization dramatically assists the realization of individual aspirations. At the same time, it attacks the social fabric that brings us together. Some of us would tend to argue that raging consumerism has directly led to a weaker society, but that's another story. One final comment on globalization. Too often, we tend to take globalization as something over which we have no influence whatsoever. Globalization, like the weather, simply happens. Consider how we talk in hushed tones about the markets. The markets. They are variously described as perturbed, buoyant, and sometimes even angry. People ask, and rightly, who's flying the plane? Governments or credit agencies? And if you take the view, which I don't, but some people do, that globalization is a dark, sinister, malevolent phenomenon, the reaction becomes one of the hapless medieval peasant who fears that the demons will come to his village. But consider that peasant. He will eventually move from sullen resentment of the carnage of the demons to radical opposition. One of the great psychological paradoxes is that people only come out in force to stop something once they really believe it to be unstoppable. And I, for one, see little sense in saying we must stop globalization. Globalization, as I said, has good and bad aspects. Unsurprisingly, as it essentially amplifies and reinforces the existing contradiction of market capitalism. But it is in itself a sort of revolutionary reality. It will keep coming and keep changing, and even the speed of change will increase. The challenge then is find new responses. So a second revolution, answering the first one, is needed. It's needed towards a strong, innovative system of global governance, towards a situation where we can start to harness and steer the process of globalization in the right path. As part of that, trade policy, which, as you know, is my present core business, must reflect change, i.e., it is not only longer just about the external tariffs on widgets, and trade policy must be an instrument and an intermediary for change. Briefly, why is the multipolar aspect of this important? First, it's a fact. The trade policy world is certainly not ruled by what some of my compatriots call US hyperpower, nor by the two elephants, the EU and the US, nor by the Quad countries, including Japan and Canada, into the mix. Developing countries are today rightly looking to assert themselves more. But the outcome, sadly for policymakers of my kind, the world is an increasingly complicated place. The question is also multipolar, because the US is not fully asserting itself on the question of global governance. Indeed, this country appears to have rather fundamental problems with the notion. Not so much on our side. One consequence of our model, and I would of course argue that there is much else than the rest of the world can learn from it, is that Europeans are used and have a big experience of an endless debate about the role of government, and more importantly in this connection, the right level of government. In short, we in Europe agree that different things need to be tackled globally, supranationally, intergovernmentally, nationally, regionally, or locally. Of course, they often disagree on which point to put in which baskets, but they agree on the baskets. And more importantly, most accept that there is a global, or at least a supranational basket. I'm not sure the same is true in the US. For example, I'm constantly warned that talk of global governance is dangerous over here, as it tends to trigger visions of black UN helicopters swooping low over small Midwestern towns, enforcing the will of the United Nations hegemon. Into this vision, of course, the WTO, the World Trade Organization, looms as the new souped-up top of the range bête noire. The WTO comes complete with wild talk of multilateral, rule-based liberalization, of which more later, and an even wider dispute settlement mechanism, which disgracefully means that every rich country, like the European Union or the US, have to comply with multilaterally agreed rules. All I can say to these fears is that the WTO is surely the weakest bête noire in the recorded history, with a loose, member-driven organization and roughly 1/4 the staff numbers of the OECD. It is only in its infancy as an institution of global governance, and frankly, that's one of the problems. So even discussing governance can seem like an ambitious project, but we have to. The fundamental question to keep in mind is efficiency versus legitimacy. Let's look at long-term ways of responding and short-term, starting with the long term. We can talk about globalization impacting our conventional political system at different levels, in relations between nation states, in relation between nation states and the global markets, and in relations between the individual and the nation state. In each of these relationships, we have to start to reassess whether or not we have the governance formula right in terms of efficiency versus legitimacy. For example, it is always right that the nation state is the right level to articulate some collective preferences, but which one? I don't know. Another example, what role can international norms and standards, and perhaps more importantly, standards setting, play? Examples, labor standards, and rules governing GMOs. Need I say more? I think it immediately becomes clear that we don't have much of a consensus for action. So what do we do? In broad terms, there are three possible models of response to perceived weakness in the current system of global governance, defined at least in terms of efficiency. First, we can go for the tabula rasa approach and try to reconstruct the system from scratch. You rarely get the chance to do this, and when you do it, for example in Westphalia or Bretton Woods, you leave your mark for generations, so you'd better get it right. It's important to think about radical options of this kind. Sometimes the costs of not going for the tabula rasa, and we've had this in Versailles after the First World War, are very, very, very high. But I don't think we are in this position yet. Second, you can do a lot at the pragmatic level. For example, on core labor standards, from ideas such as a permanent WTO ILO forum, to codes of conduct, to Kofi Annan's Global Compact, perhaps the first example of contractualization of international business activity. Or to take another example, you can organize enormous one-off efforts. For example, responding to the millennium bug. Or the problem of developing country access to AIDS medicines. But the risk, of course, is that at the international system, we will continue to deploy change as a band-aid. Better than nothing, of course, but powerless to tackle the underlying problems and to show to our citizens that we are doing this. There might be, however, a third way, to use a popular expression, at least in Europe, that must involve ad hoc but systemic improvements that the system can stand. Where necessary, creating institutions of global governance that can mediate as well as mitigate. One example of this is Jacques Delors' idea of an Economic Security Council. In this third category, I would also put World Trade Organization reforms. Dangerous, of course, in that, like roadworks on a busy highway, the organization might become actually less functional for a while. But as I believe it's still necessary, my view is that we need to spend more time thinking about this third category of options. Now, to turn briefly to the legitimacy aspects, I think that many of the Seattle protesters were dead right. The current system of governance lacks both accountability and, therefore, legitimacy. But they may be right, but they are premature. The fact is that we don't even have an operational system. As I said earlier, the World Trade Organization does not yet amount to an effective instrument of world governance, except perhaps in dispute settlement. When it does, it must be properly accountable. But we have to learn to walk before trying to run. And in this context, the NGOs are, as I see it, directly helpful. They're not always directly helpful, but on this they are directly helpful. Sylvia Ostry has written superbly recently on the three different categories of NGOs, coalitions or networks. Those who mobilize, the cutting edge, if you will, most obviously is Seattle. Those offering legal and technical support, usually on the environment, and those who advocate for developing countries. Each is hugely different in style and mission, but each in its own way is an example of a new intermediary, clearly organizing society's different impulses, different responses to global change. And incidentally, each is itself a multinational operation, of course, as they have to be to survive in a global environment. And we also need to look for other piecemeal ways of increasing legitimacy in the system, including use of market mechanisms. Consider the use of ethical criteria in investment fund management. Better information driving socially aware investment decisions, that's what they try to do. And we have clearly moved on from consumer boycotts of banks investing in apartheid to more sophisticated means of pushing for corporate and social responsibility. And this, in my view, will only increase. If I may now, before concluding, turn briefly to the short-term governance framework, I find a rather old-fashioned vehicle still very attractive. It is called a trade round. What better mechanism for liberalizing access to markets, and not just following demands of multinationals either, but continuing to open the North's market to the South? What better instrument for that? For what better instrument for simultaneously updating the global rules of the road into new important areas such as investment and competition, for bringing developing countries into a position of greater influence and responsibility into the international system, while at the same time starting to make some real progress on the concerns of civil society in areas such as environment and a dialogue on labor issues. I still hope we can launch a round as soon as possible, although the Seattle shockwaves have debilitated both the system and the players in the system, including, by the way, the Union and the US. Much, of course, will depend on the position of the new administration in Washington. We have to face up the fact that at Seattle, the failure had much to do with the lack of common agenda between the European Union and the US, despite a commonality of very strong interests. But the fact is that we have to find a short-term mechanism for addressing this deficit of global governance, and a new round is probably the nearest available thing we have. Either way, we have to keep our focus on sustainability in our policies, whether it's economic, social, environmental, and of course political sustainability. I'm clear in my own mind, for example, on how sustainable development and what we used to call trade policy fit together, essentially through shared adherence to a multilateral rule-based system. But sustainability in the short term is about picking out some key targets and being able to demonstrate some success, whether this is in trade or tackling organized crime or climate change. And of course, last but not least, fighting poverty, for that is ultimately what I think the whole project is about, or at least in my mind should be about. To illustrate that in closing, let me both quote and distort slightly the views of GFK. I suppose this is allowed in this building. And I quote, "If a free society cannot help the many who are poor, it cannot save the few who are rich." Globalization in the early part of the 21st century means that our society is freer than ever in the sense of free from constraint. We have proved again and again, and now in dramatically spiraling multiples, our ability to create fabulous wealth on this planet for the few. But we have not yet shown that we have the slightest idea of how to get to a fairer and a wiser distribution of that wealth. That's the goal of harnessing globalization, making, as I see it, the new market work better for more people. Thank you for your attention.
We now have time for questions. There are microphones on either side of the floor. Let me remind you that please keep your questions relatively brief and to the point. And I'll also ask you to identify yourself as you, just before you ask your question. So we'll start here.
My name is Cui Chang. I'm PhD student from Kennedy School. Thank you for the presentation. My poor knowledge about Europe told me that there seems to be massive subsidy in the agriculture sector under the Common Agricultural Policy in European Union. But at the same time, I find it very hard to justify with the comparative advantage of other trade theories. In the international trade negotiation stage, you always find that nations find themselves not ready to liberalize textile or agriculture sector are the same nations that find it far more too lenient to give more than 5 years time to developing countries to cope with the complex issues of intellectual property protection. I'm wondering if you could illuminate me on the justification of subsidy, and if you would recommend similar policies to developing countries who has a far more fragile community to protect. Thank you.
Yeah, on agriculture and whether the subsidies which we in the European Union have on agriculture, and by the way, the amount is the same on both sides of the Atlantic, if you compare it to the GNP. So it's not a specifically EU problem. We have the view in the European Union that agriculture is not a sort of average standard economic activity. As we see it, it has what we call a multifunctional role, and it also has to do about environment, food security, food safety, landscape, and social issues. So you're right in saying that if we let the market settle this problem, on the 7 million farmers we have in Europe, probably 5 million will disappear because they don't have the comparative advantage. We don't want this to happen. And we will not let this happen for reasons which have to do with our political choices. So we've made the choice that these sort of uncompetitive relative to international standards, or what could be international standards, will still be there, and we will subsidize them, which we, I believe, are perfectly entitled to do. What we're not entitled to do, or what we shouldn't be entitled to do, as I see it, is, as we've done it for years and years and years, until the 90s, through a subsidization policy which was trade distortive. At that time, our policy was basically on high prices, big differences of prices with the world level, hence necessity of high trade protection and export subsidies in order to do with the surpluses. We've started changing this in the 90s, and we've now clearly gone in this direction. I mean, the level of support of export, for instance, has decreased from sort of 50% of our export level 10 years ago to less than 10% today. So the question is not whether we should subsidize agriculture or not, as I see it. The question is, how can we do that in a non-trade distortive way, which basically means switching to a deficiency payment system. Of course, at the end of the day, we will produce things which others with a better comparative advantage could have produced. That is true, but it's less and less trade distortive. Textiles is, of course, different, and on this, I think we have to open our markets. We've taken, in the Uruguay round, more market access decisions for developing countries, and we can and should do that, for instance, in opening our market on textiles and a number of developing countries opening their markets on clothing. They have a comparative advantage on textiles. We may have a comparative advantage on clothing. And last bit of answer to your question, I think we also sometimes have to take unilateral decisions in trade, and hence this initiative which I have pushed and which the Commission is now pushing in Europe in what we call everything but arms, which means that we would commit ourselves unilaterally to import duty-free, quota-free 100% of export for the least developed countries, the 49 least developed countries. I think we should do this because part of the trade liberalization has to do with exchanging things with these 49 countries who really don't have any sort of bargaining power. I think we should go in this direction. We've proposed this, and it's now, this legislation is now being examined by the Council and the Parliament.
Good evening. I'm Lothar Ehring. I'm German and student here at the Kennedy School. I have a question about the structure of global governance when it operates through international organizations. Given their high number, I would like to know whether you view this as an efficient division of labor so that cooperation and convergence should be worked for, or is it rather as absurd and inefficient as the idea of several governments at the top level within one country, so that integration and merger would be the conclusion?
That's a big one. I mean, we clearly have inherited a system of international organizations from a time where globalization was not what it is today. We inherited it partly from the First World War, which was a big globalization shock, and partly from the Second World War, which also was a big globalization shock. And I think the new idea that both after the First World War and the Second World War appeared that we needed institutions to harness the system is still there. So this basic idea is fine, and I agree with it. The problem is that we've inherited, we've got the San Francisco family, the Bretton Woods family, we've got all these technical organizations, and they've been built at a time where sort of classical diplomacy based on the sovereignty of nation state plus a few privileges for the winners of that war could do the trick. It clearly today is inefficient. And I have no doubt about that. And there's clearly a lack of coherence, for instance, in what we do in trade in terms of liberalization and openness, even with special preferences for developing countries or transition periods as we have in the WTO agreement, what international organizations committed to development do and what international organizations committed to finance regulation do. There's no doubt about that. And we must make progress because the result of this is probably an inefficient use of the resources we put into this system, whether it's money or political energy, it's the same. Now, the inefficiency question is one of the questions we have to address. It's not the only one. The accountability, legitimacy, visibility, controllability is another one. And I think we should not sort of redevise a nice, coherent system, which I can do. If you give me 2 or 3 hours and a piece of paper and a pencil, I can do that. I can do that in a sort of extremely technocratic way. And I can even, because I have some political experience, devise something which the various bosses of these various organizations and their various bosses which sit in their various boards could swallow. It's going to be very difficult because they all will look for their own power gain. But I will not, doing this, ensure any sort of insurance that this will be the least accountable. And this is a much more difficult one. And I think those of us who are working on this, and those of you who are working on this, because there's extremely good research and extremely good studies we're doing this on this, should not deal only with the sort of visible, easy part of it, which is inefficiency. It's not easy, but it's relatively easy. The difficult part is accountability, is what sort of democratic constituency can we figure so that the decisions which will be taken at this level are considered as legitimate by the people who at the end of the day will have to implement them. And we in the European Union have some experience about that. I mean, we have an extremely sophisticated supranational governance system, and I think we've partly nicely answered the question of efficiency. We still do not have answered in a sufficiently convincingly manner the accountability problem, and on this we have to work.
Hi, Mr. Lamy. My name is Albert Cho. I'm a junior at the college, and I just wanted to thank you for coming because I'm a big fan and it's cool to get to talk to you. But I just sort of had a question because I've been reading some of the speeches that you've been giving about the relationship and the treatment of the World Trade Organization on process and production methods in the trading system. And I was curious how you would propose to renegotiate the treatment of PPMs in the World Trade Organization and what the implications for that are on the debates over environmental and labor standards and how those can be reconciled with the interests and concerns of developing countries.
Well, I mean, that's I think, a fairly good example of why we need a trade round and why we need more rules in multilateral trading systems. Process and production methods are questions which are extremely dear to part of our domestic constituency. And I am bombarded by petitions and emails by NGOs who ask me to ensure that process and production methods will be inserted into WTO legislation so that we can protect trade and eliminate trade and notably imports, which would not comply with process and production methods. On the other side, I spent a large part of my time traveling to developing countries whose big problem with the European Union, or by the way, with the US, because we have fairly same standards, except for a few GMOs and hormones, which we are more cautious about, they have basically the same problem with these two elephants. And their problem is, how can we match this? It's a race against time. Each time we do a big effort in order to match your sanitary or food standards, including with PPMs, you're inventing a new one. And I say, well, yes, because we found new scientific advice and our consumers want this to be labeled this way, for instance. So, I mean, we're facing, obviously, two extremely well-founded and legitimate demands on the system. And, I mean, we should do what we do in one of our nation states when politicians are confronted with two very legitimate demands. We don't have a voting system, and we cannot ask, I mean, the Thais and the Indians and the Bangladeshi who have problems with our PPMs to vote, and the Europeans and the Americans would vote, and we have a decision. It won't work this way. We all know it won't work this way. So we have to address it through a negotiating legislative process which will make clear to the developing countries that our PPM systems are not discriminatory, that they are proportional to the goal we have to follow in terms of protection of health or food safety, and that it politically convinced them that it's not a trick to protect our markets. And on the other side, we have to convince our people that maybe some sort of transition period would be all right, or that if we change our PPM under their pressure every year, it creates big problems for the Thais, the Indians, or the Bangladeshi. And at the end of the day, we have to match these two things. And on top of that, of course, we have, and that goes back to the previous question, we probably have to redirect our development assistance or technical assistance so that helping developing countries to match this sort of problem, which is so important for their exports, is focused on this, maybe instead of building roads and bridges, which are extremely expensive, whereas these technologies are not extremely expensive. So, I mean, it's a governance problem, and I don't think we can find a solution by any other way than compromising visibly in a transparent manner in a sort of legislative process, which I call around.
Hello, my name is Christina Davis. I am a PhD candidate in the Department of Government. I have a question about trade policy in the WTO, and it seems that in general everyone will support the idea of free trade and international trade rules, but then when it gets to specifics, everyone has their exception, true of the United States and the European Union. When it comes to the beef growth hormone trade dispute, how do you justify to the international community why Europe deserves an exception when the WTO and GATT have found its policy to be in violation? And then in turn, when you face the European Parliament, does the WTO ruling have any weight in terms of persuading Europe that it should change its policy?
Let me first make clear that we all should make a sort of distinction between old issues about trade in goods, which were sort of protectionist lobby related. We all know some of these issues. I don't think that most of the new issues in trade, i.e. health, environment, and so on, are of this kind. I mean, the political paradigm behind this has changed. The people in the streets demonstrating against the WTO because it's bad for environment are not protectionist. They may sometimes be financed here and there by lobbies which have their own interests, but they're not basically protectionist lobbies. So it's a different thing. On the question of beef hormones, I think you should read the panel decisions, and including this one, which said that the European Union violated WTO rules not because it founded its ban on sufficient scientific advice. We were condemned by WTO because there was no scientific advice at all, which was a bloody mistake on our side. And the panel clearly said that in order to be justifiable according to WTO, it had to be founded on scientific assessment, but that this scientific assessment did not have to be, for instance, the majority of the scientific advice, that even light scientific advice that we had doubts over a number of these hormones could be okay. And this is why I have redrafted the legislation with my colleague responsible for agriculture and the other one for consumer affairs. We have redrafted this legislation and based it on the evidence we have from scientific advice that a number of the growth hormones are cancerinogen. And of course, if I have scientific advice that it's cancerinogen, I mean, my duty as a public authority is to ban the import of these things. Maybe the US advice on this is not the same, but I mean, if I compare the situation with what it was a year ago, I think looking at public opinion and the problems, the thing has moved rather in our direction rather than in the previous US direction. So we're not asking for an exception. We're asking for rules that make clear that when confronted between a trade opening measure and a health protection measure, the health protection measure will prevail, provided, and back to the previous question, provided it is done in a transparent, proportional, non-discriminatory way. After all, we're not banning US imports of hormone beef and not banning EU production of hormone beef. We're banning hormone beef, full stop. It's not discriminatory. Whether it's proportional is something which a WTO panel can address, and I'm ready to make it. I mean, for instance, we have a balance between what's definitive and what's provisional in this, which addresses the question of proportionality. But as a rule, it must be possible to protect health. And on the other side, we have to do it in ways and means that can convince a judge, or even better than a judge, American public opinion, that if we have doubts about that, they should understand we'd better not eat it.
My name is Hiroki Yoshia, a Fletcher School student. I want to ask about a new round of WTO, because after the failure in Seattle, you and world leaders are trying to overcome the failure and build up confidence in WTO, especially in the developing countries and also NGO in environment or labor. But I know you and other world leaders made a great effort to build up confidence in WTO. But still, we saw a lot of Protestants in ASEAN in Seoul still. And some people say that the situation has changed, and it is easy to launch the next round. But I think the major problem has not solved yet. So I want to ask you, what do you think about the situation of developing countries and NGOs in this respect of the launch of new WTO round? Thank you.
I mean, and the reason why we didn't launch this round in Seattle and not even since Seattle has basically to do with two issues: North-North issues and North-South issues. There's no agreement between the US, EU, and Japan as of today, no official agreement, and we're working hard on trying to find one, but there's no official agreement on what an agenda of a round could be. And we've always considered that this is a sort of prerequisite. We all know that it's a prerequisite, but it's not sufficient, that the developing countries also have to agree on an agenda, and we're not there yet. So the reason why we haven't launched a round has to do with these disagreements in substance. I mean, of course NGOs are there, and there are a number of people who are demonstrating whichever place an international institution makes a ministerial. This is part of life, and these guys express fears and questions to which we have to answer, as we have to answer to our citizens, as we have to be answerable to our citizens, our parliaments, and for myself, the European Parliament, on the benefits of trade opening, because, I mean, there's also another side of the medal. So there's the issue of substance. How can we agree on that? And then there's this issue of political presentation, so that everybody knows what sort of stake he has in the machine. And by the way, on most of the issues which NGOs are caring about, such as environment, for instance. I mean, one of the reasons why we couldn't launch around at Seattle was that because on environment, Europe's position was too demanding, both for the United States and for the developing countries. And until we have solved this sort of issue, it's very difficult to progress. But the real problem is on issues of substance. It's not on issues of presentation. And Seattle failed mainly because of these disagreements on substance.
Yes, my name is Rudy Brewers, and I feel compelled to ask whether you'll be eating any beef while you're here in America. But that's not my only question. My question is related to some of the protests that have taken place at McDonald's restaurants in France and recently in Italy, and how you might reconcile the views of some citizens in Europe with your idea of a progressive trade policy. Thank you.
On the first one, as was kindly reminded in your introduction, I am on a marathon diet. So a few hormone growth might help me towards the 32nd kilometer. And for the sole reason, I might take this risk if I'm really sure it will sort of bump me up. On the question of why do people in Europe inflame or sack McDonald's, I think it has to do with what I was trying to expose in my remarks about fears about globalization. Some people believe that globalization, trade opening, is bad for them. I believe they're wrong, but that if they have this problem, we have to address it. And on top of this, I believe they're wrong, but they're not always wrong. Globalization has or may have a negative impact on people's lives. So they have this problem. There are a few internationally well-known brands, and probably McDonald's is one of these, because I mean you can't go anywhere without seeing a McDonald's somewhere. So it is sort of assimilated to this globalization. And on top of that, it's a US brand, as we all know, and the US are probably seen in those constituencies are sort of the big architects behind all this. We have to take these questions seriously. I don't think we should discount them. I don't think we should overplay them. It's a question of political accurateness in judgment to see whether it's a large part of the opinion or a small part of the opinion. But the fact is that we have to answer these questions, which I spend part of my time doing with European NGOs. There's no way you can run a trade policy in Brussels now without meeting with NGOs, and I meet with NGOs in Brussels, and I will meet with NGOs tomorrow in Washington, because I want to have their view of what's happening here and their view of what we should do. So it leads us to sort of much more exposure. It doesn't lead me to the conclusion that we'd better shrink WTO, or shrink the IMF, or shrink the World Bank, because on this I disagree. I think I have rather real concerns which are very near to their concerns, but my own answer is not less governance, it's more governance. If we have problems with globalization, which I can understand, the answer is not stop globalization, it's start governance. And this is a debate which I think we must and we should publicly have. And I try to spend a part of my time doing this.
This will have to be the last question.
Hi, my name is Bernd Beber. I'm a freshman here at Harvard College. Talking about globalization is apparently not just about a trade of goods on an international level, but it's also about flow of capital investments across the globe. So I wanted to know what your suggestions are for limiting speculative investments and what your opinion is concerning a Tobin tax.
I think if you can explain me what speculative investment is versus non-speculative investment, my answer to your question will be clearer than it will be. I've been a banker for some years, and I'm not quite sure I myself, having looked at these markets, and can really make a difference between what's speculative and non-speculative. There are problems in our international financial systems about instability of financial flows, and this has to do with regulations on the one side and policies on the other side. And I believe in some cases we should be able to take policy initiatives or measures to limit the instability of the system. The European Union position on the Tobin tax does not exist because we have never had a debate inside the institutions of the European Union, except in the European Parliament, where a draft motion for studying this was defeated by, I think, 2 votes, which were missing on the extreme left part of the European Parliament for reasons which are purely anecdotal. So the European Parliament is the only institution who sort of stepped in this direction, and the Commission has not taken any initiative to propose to the Council a sort of Tobin tax system, and we haven't really discussed that in the Commission. I believe the majority of the Commissioner's view is that a tax of a few percentage probably is not the right way to address the speculation system or the speculating drive, if there is one. If you want to stop this, if that exists, if you want to stop it, it's not a tax like this which will stop it. And on the other side, if the problem is how do you get money, there probably are more clever ways of doing this. But we haven't discussed this yet.
Please join me in thanking Pascal Lamy for an extremely thoughtful presentation this evening, and our wish that he will return to Harvard and the Kennedy School again soon. That's very good. Very, very thoughtful. You got some hard questions, but you handled them very well. We're going to go out through here to have you meet with the press.